Welcome to Compound Thought, where the best investments start with knowledge. Today, we're embarking on an in-depth exploration of a book that's truly shaking up the financial world. Nick Maggiulli's Just Keep Buying, Proven Ways to Save Money and Build Your Wealth. Now, Nick Maggiulli isn't your typical finance guru. He's, a personal finance blogger who started his own journey really grappling with financial uncertainty in his mid-20s. His path from obsessing over these minor asset allocation details with just like $1,000 to becoming this data-driven challenger of mainstream financial advice is incredibly compelling. The book itself, well, it's earned really high praise. We're talking everyone's from James Clear, author of Atomic Habits, to Morgan Housel from The Psychology of Money, highlighting its blend of thoughtful insights and actionable evidence-based wisdom. Smartly structured into two main sections, Saving and Investing, offering a pretty comprehensive guide to building wealth.
Yeah, and our mission in this discussion is really to unpack Maggiulli's data-driven insights and those actionable takeaways. We want to help you, the listener, cut through a lot of the noise of conventional financial wisdom. We hope you can discover proven methods to build wealth that might even challenge some of your existing beliefs about saving and investing. And crucially, it's all firmly grounded in evidence. It's truly about equipping you to act smarter and live richer by understanding what genuinely works, not just what sounds good on the surface.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The core mantra of the book, Just Keep Buying, it actually wasn't born from a spreadsheet or anything like that, but from a really powerful and frankly quite stark personal story about Maggiulli's family, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, he kicks things off with the story of his grandfather. Now, this is a man who retired at 55, had a comfortable pension, later got Social Security, bringing in, I think, a total of $2,200 a month. And, crucially, he lived with his mother, which meant he had almost zero living costs. Yet, despite this, seemingly ideal financial situation, his grandfather died at 81 with literally no assets, nothing. Turns out he had gambled it all away over 26 years. His addiction just progressed from horse racing to high-stakes card games like blackjack, baccarat.
Wow. That's a truly sobering what-if scenario he paints. What Maggiulli reveals is if his grandfather had simply invested half of that money, he was going to gamble away anyway.
Yeah.
Even during one of the worst decades in U.S. stock market history, right? That 2000-2009 period. He would have died a millionaire.
Right.
He could have kept gambling with the other half and still left a substantial legacy.
Yeah.
It's just such a stark illustration of the transformative power of consistent investing, even for those of us, who might not face something like a gambling addiction. It just highlights how easily potential wealth can slip away if we're not really intentional with our money.
Indeed. And Maggiulli's own early financial journey also played a key role in this. After college, he describes being almost neurotic about money, obsessing over asset allocation when he only had $1,000 in his retirement account. He'd spend hours analyzing, should it be 15% bonds, 20%? Yet at the same time, he was blowing $100 in a single night out in San Francisco, dinner, drinks, Ubers, essentially a year's potential investment returns just gone.
Right.
And that was the realization, wasn't it? That learning about investing wasn't enough. He needed a practical framework, something simple. This led him to start his blog of Dollars and Data, which kind of forced him to confront these issues head on, crystallize his thinking, and eventually led to that three-word mantra that forms the title of the book. Just keep buying.
What's really fascinating here is that this isn't just, a catchy phrase or some abstract theory he cooked up. It's a philosophy born from real-world experience, both his family's and his own, and a deep dive into cold, hard data. The book really promises to answer fundamental questions based on evidence, not just conjecture. And Maggiulli isn't afraid to challenge a lot of that mainstream advice that, let's face it, we've kind of come to accept as gospel.
Exactly. He makes it clear his goal isn't just to be controversial for the sake of it, but to use data to find the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. And some of those truths are genuinely surprising, aren't they? For instance, you'll learn why you might actually need to save less than you think.
Yeah.
Or in certain contexts, why credit card debt isn't always purely bad. He presents really compelling arguments against hoarding cash to buy the dip, which is such common advice, or why most of us as individual investors probably shouldn't be picking individual stocks. Instead, he sort of reframes market corrections, those moments of widespread panic, as potentially significant buying opportunities. Ultimately, the book's aim is to help you act smarter and live richer by understanding these proven ways to build wealth, cutting through the common financial traps and misperceptions.
So, with that foundational philosophy in mind, where do we even begin? How do we apply this? Maggiulli offers a really powerful framework right near the start of the book. He says, saving is for the poor and investing is for the rich. Now, that sounds provocative, maybe even a bit harsh, But it's clearly not as simple as it sounds on the surface, is it?
No, it's actually quite nuanced when you dig into it.
Yeah.
He clarifies that poor and rich here are used in both an absolute and a relative sense. So like, as a recent college graduate, you might not be absolutely poor, but you're poor relative to your future wealthier self. Makes sense. The core principle is this. If you don't have much money invested yet, your primary focus, your energy, should be on increasing your savings rate and consistently investing that money. Get the ball rolling. But once you've built up a sizable portfolio, your attention should naturally shift more towards optimizing those investments, allocation, efficiency, that sort of thing.
And it gives us a pretty practical way to figure out where we stand on this save invest continuum, as he calls it. You basically compare what you can comfortably save in the next year. He calls this your expected savings, right? Compare that to your expected investment growth, which is just your current investments multiplied by some reasonable expected annual return, say 5% or 10%. If your expected savings are higher, you focus on saving more. If your expected investment growth is higher, you focus more on optimizing your investments. And if they're kind of close, well, then you would focus on both. It's a dynamic thing, not static.
And that's the key, it's dynamic. This framework reveals a natural long-term shift in focus. Early in your career, your savings are going to dwarf your investment growth. It just makes mathematical sense. But Maggiulli illustrates this with a clear example. Someone saving $10,000 per year at a 5% return. In year one, yeah, those annual savings, $10K, are 20 times greater than the investment growth, $500. But fast forward 30 years. Now, assuming they kept that up, the investment growth on their accumulated pot is actually 3 times greater than their annual savings contribution. The really profound insight here is that by the end of a typical working life, for most people, nearly 70%, think about that, 70% of their total wealth comes from investment gains, from compounding, not from the annual contributions they made. This truly underscores the importance of adapting your financial attention as your wealth grows over time. Where you put your focus needs to change.
That's a crucial point, yeah. And it really leads us to consider how much traditional saves advice might be, well, missing the mark. If it's not this one-size-fits-all approach, what does Maggiulli find specifically wrong with all those common savings rules we hear constantly? Save X% or have Y by age Z.
He really takes aim at those rules, like save 20% of your income or have 1x your income saved by 30. He thinks they're often unhelpful, even stressful. He uses this fascinating analogy from biology about the Dolly Varden jar. It's a type of fish. Apparently, these fish can actually shrink or grow their digestive tracts based on food availability in their environment. It's called phenotypic plasticity. And his point is, just as these fish adapt their biology, we need to adapt our spending and saving habits to our unique financial environment. We're not all the same. Mainstream advice often just assumes income stability, but the data he cites, like from the panel study of income dynamics, shows income volatility has actually increased over the decades, especially with more two-income households where you risk 2 job losses. And it completely ignores the vastly unequal saving capacities across the population. The bottom 20% of earners, for instance, save almost nothing on average, maybe 1%, the top 1%. They save over 50% of their income. So a blanket save 20% rule just doesn't fit the real world for so many people. He argues it's misguided because it ignores these individual realities and fluctuations.
Okay, so if those fixed rules don't really work, what does work, according to Maggiulli? He basically says we should save what you can, which sounds incredibly simple, maybe too simple. But he argues it's fundamentally about reducing financial stress, not piling more on. He even shares how once he stopped trying to follow arbitrary rules, he stopped obsessing over the numbers and actually started enjoying his money more, which seems like a better place to be. He suggests simplifying things like maybe estimating your variable spending by just using one credit card for all of it. That way, tracking is easier, and it reduces the mental load of detailed budgeting.
Exactly. And this approach helps combat what he calls the never feel rich paradox. It's this weird phenomenon where people consistently feel like they need more money, no matter how much they actually have. He cites surveys where average Americans think $2.3 million makes you rich, but millionaires themselves say, no, it's closer to $7.5 million. It's like the goalposts keep moving, we get richer, yet we still feel like it's not quite enough, constantly worrying about saving enough. But the book makes a pretty bold argument here. If you actually dig into the data, you might find you're already saving too much.
Right, that's the really counterintuitive idea, isn't it? Especially with all the constant media worry about the retirement crisis. Why you need to save less than you think. What's the strongest evidence he uses to back up such a, provocative statement? And are there situations where maybe it doesn't quite hold true?
He points to something he calls the retiree spending paradox. And the evidence is quite compelling. Research from places like Texas Tech and the Investments in Wealth Institute shows that most retirees actually don't spend down their savings as much as theory predicts. Instead, their financial assets often hold steady or even increase throughout retirement. Why? Because they're often living comfortably just off the income generated by Social Security, any pensions, and their existing investment portfolios. This means many never actually need to sell down their principal savings balance. The result: significant wealth often gets left to heirs. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars on average. So his argument is that the fear of running out of money in retirement is often a much greater psychological burden than the actual statistical risk for many people. This implies that, yeah, maybe many of us can save less than we anxiously think we need to.
That's a really powerful revelation. Okay, so for those who do actually need to save more or want to accelerate their savings, the book tackles what he calls the biggest lie in personal finance. And he says it's not what you'd probably expect. It's about this intense focusing on income, not spending. So what exactly is this biggest lie he's referring to?
The biggest lie, according to Maggiulli, is the pervasive idea that you can get rich just by cutting your spending. The whole cut out the lattes and become a millionaire narrative. He argues that while both sides of the equation, income and spending, obviously affect your savings income spending, focusing primarily on income growth is often more impactful and definitely more sustainable in the long run. He brings up that data point again. For the lowest 20% of earners in the U.S., over 100% of their after-tax income already goes to just 4 basic necessities: food, housing, healthcare, and transportation. He gives the numbers for 2019. This group earned about $1,020 a month after tax, but spent nearly $1,947 on just those necessities. There's literally no wiggle room to cut back further. Where exactly are they supposed to find savings?
That's a stark reality check, isn't it? So that whole $5 coffee turning into $1 million myth is really just a harmful distraction for most people.
Pretty much, yeah. He calls out some personal finance gurus who preach this frugal mindset, but often got rich themselves through high incomes, not just by skipping coffee. He argues that the math behind saving small amounts to become a millionaire often requires completely unrealistic, decades-long high investment returns that are very unlikely. And he finds this kind of advice condescending. It ignores systemic issues and implies financial trouble is just due to buying lattes or Tide Pods rather than things like stagnant wages or lack of initial wealth. He even cites empirical research, like studies on poverty traps in places like Kenya, which show that a lack of initial capital, not a lack of motivation or talent, is what often keeps people poor. So the conclusion is pretty clear. The most consistent path to building significant wealth is to focus on growing your income and then investing that increased income into income-producing assets. Sure, periodic spending reviews are good for efficiency, maybe finding some waste, but obsessing over minor cuts misses the bigger, more impactful picture, increasing your earning power.
That makes a lot of sense. So, okay, if increasing income is the more sustainable and impactful path, how does the book suggest we actually do that? It offers a useful framework around what he calls our human capital. Could you break that down?
Right. Your human capital is essentially the economic value of your skills, your knowledge, and crucially, your time. It's an asset, just like money, that you need to convert into financial capital. Maggiulli outlines 5 main methods to do this conversion. 1. Sell your time or expertise directly. Think hourly work, consulting. Pros: direct income. Cons: limited by hours, doesn't scale easily. 2. Sell a skill or service, like freelancing, building a personal brand. Pros: can command higher pay, builds reputation. Cons: still often time limited, scaling can be tricky. 3. Teach people, especially scalable online through courses on platforms like Teachable or YouTube, either self-paced or live. Pros: highly scalable income potential. Cons: requires real expertise and marketing skills. 4. Sell a product. This could be books, digital guides, software, even courses fall here too. Pros: scalable, you have full ownership. Cons: very labor-intensive upfront, no guarantee of payoff. And 5. The traditional path. Climb the corporate ladder. Pros: gain skills, experience, often less income risk. Cons: less control over your time and work. But he emphasizes the ultimate goal beyond just earning more labor income should be ownership. Use that additional income to acquire income-producing assets. He gives the example of former NFL player Jerry Richardson, who really built his fortune by acquiring Hardee's franchises after his football career, not just from his playing salary. It's about shifting your mindset to thinking like an owner, not just an employee.
Okay, so once you start earning more, maybe through one of those methods, how do you actually enjoy it without that constant guilt that so much financial advice seems to breed? The book has some really brilliant practical strategies for how to spend money guilt-free, like something he calls the 2X rule.
What's that all about?
Yeah, Maggiulli really pushes back against the constant guilt-tripping in personal finance. He mentions Susie Orman saying buying coffee is like peeing away $1 million, or Gary Vaynerchuk questioning people's work ethic if they're not grinding 24/7. He argues this just causes anxiety. Even millionaires worry constantly about running out of money. It's an unhealthy way to relate to your finances. So he offers two really neat tips for guilt-free spending. The first one is the 2x rule. The rule is simple. Anytime you decide to splurge on something non-essential, you must invest an equal amount into income-producing assets like stocks or bonds, or donate that same amount to charity. So if you buy, say, a $400 pair of fancy shoes, you also have to immediately invest another $400 or donate $400. This simple rule, he argues, removes the psychological guilt because your indulgence is directly matched by either building your future wealth or doing good in the world. It aligns the splurge with your values.
That's actually genius. It feels like a practical way to balance enjoying today with saving for tomorrow. It allows you to enjoy your wealth without constantly second-guessing every single purchase. What's the second tip he offers?
The second tip builds on this idea of values. It's to focus on maximizing fulfillment, distinguishing that from just chasing momentary happiness. He uses the analogy of running a marathon. The process might be painful, definitely not happy in every moment, but completing it brings a deep sense of fulfillment. So he suggests you should justify purchases based on whether they genuinely enhance your occupational mastery, autonomy, or sense of purpose. For instance, maybe that daily latte is justified if it genuinely allows you a moment of peace that enhances your focus at work, contributing to your long-term well-being and career goals. It's less about the purchase itself and more about how you justify it in your own head. Ask yourself, will this truly contribute to my long-term fulfillment? Ultimately, the book asserts that the only right way to spend money is the way that works for you. Research even shows that purchases aligning with your psychological profile lead to higher life satisfaction, more so than just income level alone. You have to figure out what you truly want and value.
Building on that idea of enjoying your money, what happens when your income does grow significantly? We're constantly told to avoid lifestyle creep like the plague. But the book seems to offer a more nuanced perspective. How much lifestyle creep is actually okay, according to Maggiulli?
He starts with a pretty stark cautionary tale of the Vanderbilt family. Cornelius Vanderbilt left a fortune equivalent to billions today, but within just 2 generations, extreme lifestyle creep, we're talking dining on horseback, literally burning money, meant none of his descendants were even millionaires. A dramatic example of lifestyle creep unchecked. Now, lifestyle creep is simply, increasing your spending after you get an income increase, or maybe just to keep up with your peers. Maggiulli acknowledges that, hey, some lifestyle creep is satisfying. You work hard, you should enjoy some of the fruits of your labor, that makes sense. But there's a limit. He proposes a simple rule of thumb, the 50% rule. For most people, spending more than 50% of any future raises or bonuses will likely start delaying your planned retirement date.
Okay. So a straightforward 50% rule for raises. Spend half, save half.
Pretty much, yeah. Half for you now, enjoy it, half for future you, meaning towards retirement or other long-term goals. He explains that the most important factor determining how much of a raise you actually need to save to keep your retirement timeline constant is your current savings rate. He provides examples. If you're currently only saving 5% of your income, you only need to save about 27% of your raise to stay on track. But if you're already a high saver, say saving 50% of your income, you need to save a much larger chunk, like 76% of that raise, to maintain your timeline. But the 50% rule is just a simple, easy-to-remember guideline that works well for many people. It's actionable and nicely aligns with that 2x rule for splurges we just talked about.
Okay, now let's pivot and talk about the dreaded D word.
Yeah.
Debt. Most financial experts, they basically tell you to avoid it at all costs, especially high-interest debt like credit cards. But Maggiulli takes a different angle, arguing debt isn't good or bad. It depends on how you use it. And here's where it gets really interesting, because he uses this analogy about bet hedging in desert annual plans. Tell us about that.
Right, it's a fascinating analogy. These desert plants apparently don't sprout all their seeds at once, even when conditions seem perfect. Why? Because if an unexpected dry spell hits later, all their offspring would die out. So they deliberately keep some seeds dormant as a kind of risk reduction strategy, maximizing their long-term reproductive success, not just success in a single year. It's bet hedging. Maggiulli applies this thinking to debt. Traditional advice screams, never take credit card debt. But he looks at this phenomenon called the credit card debt puzzle. This is where some people hold high-interest credit card debt despite having enough liquid savings in the bank to pay it off completely. It seems irrational, right? But researchers found that these borrower savers often perceive their future access to credit as uncertain. They might worry about losing their job or facing an emergency where they can't get a loan, so they willingly pay that short-term interest cost as a way to reduce the perceived long-term risk of not having funds available when they might desperately need them. It's a form of bet hedging with their finances. He also mentions examples from the book Portfolios of the Poor, where high interest rates acted as a behavioral crutch, forcing people to pay back loans quickly and rebuild savings. So the book's conclusion isn't that debt is good, but that it's a financial tool. And like any tool, its utility really depends on the specific context and how thoughtfully it's used.
That's definitely a unique way to frame it. So if debt can be a tool, where does it generally make the most sense to deploy it? And what about the less obvious, maybe non-financial cost of carrying debt?
The book points to higher education as one area where taking on debt is often a very sound investment, despite the rising costs we hear so much about. On average, college graduates still earn significantly more over their lifetime. Maggiulli quotes figures suggesting around $1 million more over a 40-year career compared to high school graduates. He provides a simple formula to estimate the value. Take the total increased lifetime earnings, divide by 2, and subtract the lost earnings from not working during the program. For many degrees, especially at public universities, the math works out easily, making student loan debt a strategic decision for significantly increasing your long-term human capital and earning potential.
Makes sense. But there are downsides too, right? Beyond just the interest payments.
Absolutely. And the book doesn't shy away from these non-financial costs. Research clearly links higher levels of debt, particularly unsecured debt like credit cards and payday loans, to lower psychological well-being, increased stress, depression, and even worse physical health outcomes like higher blood pressure. Interestingly, mortgage debt seems to cause the least amount of stress, probably because it's tied to a tangible, valuable asset and seen as good debt. He also acknowledges personality factors like debt aversion. Some people just sleep better paying off their mortgage early, even if it's not the absolute optimal financial move on paper. Peace of mind has value. Ultimately, he concludes the most benefit from debt comes to those who can choose when to take it on, using it strategically, maybe for that education, or to smooth consumption or increase returns rather than being forced into it out of obligation due to unexpected emergencies, which is sadly the reality for many households caught in a cycle of debt.
Okay, building on that idea of strategic financial decisions, let's turn to one of the biggest ones most of us will ever make. Should you rent or should you buy? The book makes it clear it's about much more than just the dollars and cents.
It absolutely is. Maggiulli starts this chapter with a really touching personal story about his own grandparents' home. They bought it back in 1972 for $28,000, and today it's worth something like $600,000. Now, sure, the financial return was substantial, about 3x after inflation. But he emphasizes that the priceless part was the emotional return. That house was the stable foundation where generations of his family were raised, filled with cherished memories and traditions. It represents a kind of social wealth, a sense of belonging and stability that often comes with home ownership, and you really can't put a price tag on that.
That's a lovely perspective. But okay, let's get practical. What about those hidden costs of home ownership that people often overlook when they're caught up in the dream, especially compared to the simplicity of renting?
Yeah, and the book really digs into the numbers here, which can be sobering. Beyond just the down payment, which is obviously significant, there are substantial one-time transaction costs. You've got closing costs, things like application fees, appraisals, loan origination fees, which can easily run 2% to 5% of the home's value. Then there are the real estate agent commissions, typically around 6% combined for the buyers and sellers agents. So just the transaction costs alone, excluding your down payment, can be anywhere from, say, 2% up to 11% of the home's purchase price. This immediately tells you that buying and selling frequently, like with starter homes, is often a losing proposition because these costs eat up any appreciation. And then you have the ongoing costs. Property taxes, which vary wildly. Homeowners insurance. If you put less than 20% down, you'll likely pay private mortgage insurance, PMI, which can be another 0.5% to 1% of the loan value annually. And the big one people underestimate, maintenance. The rule of thumb is 1% to 2% of the home's value every year. On average, that's $3,000 to $6,000 a year on a $300,000 home. Plus, he points out the often overlooked time cost. Mowing lawns, scheduling repairs, DIY projects. Home ownership is basically like taking on a part-time job. Renters, by contrast, have fixed, predictable housing costs each month. Homeowners face these variable, often unpredictable expenses that can pop up anytime.
That's definitely a lot to factor in. And what about housing purely as an investment? Is it really the long-term ticket to wealth that many people seem to believe it is?
Well, the data suggests maybe not as much as we think. He cites Nobel laureate Robert Shiller's research, which found that the inflation-adjusted return on U.S. housing was actually only 0.6% a year between 1915 and 2015, and most of that tiny gain came after the year 2000. For nearly a century before that, real housing values were largely flat. He illustrates the opportunity cost again using his grandparents' home. That $28,000 house, even with its appreciation, yielded significantly less than if they had simply invested the equivalent mortgage payment, $280 a month, into a broad basket of U.S. stocks over the same period. The stocks would have been worth maybe 4 times as much. Now, housing value doesn't typically crash as violently as stocks can, which provides stability, but it's also unlikely to be your sole path to significant wealth, especially since extracting that value usually requires selling the home, which incurs those high transaction costs again.
So, based on all that, the book concludes it's not really an if you should buy, but more about when it makes sense for you.
Exactly. Given the strong societal reasons, home ownership is still the primary way many U.S. households build wealth. It's tied to communities, schools, etc. The question isn't whether to buy, but when is the right time for your specific situation. The ideal time, he suggests, is when you have some predictability in your future, a stable job, maybe family plans are settling down. Affordability is obviously key, ideally having that 20% down payment, though not always strictly necessary, and keeping your debt-to-income DTI ratio below the typical 43% mortgage limit helps ensure you're not overstretched. He also makes a strong case for waiting, if possible, to buy a home you plan to stay in longer rather than a starter home, precisely because of those high transaction costs we talked about. Minimize buying and selling. And while the first few years of ownership carry the most financial risk, job loss, needing to move unexpectedly, that risk generally decreases over time. Why? Because your mortgage payment stays fixed, in nominal terms, while your income hopefully goes with inflation over the years, making the payment feel smaller and smaller in real terms over decades. Ultimately, it's a huge decision, deeply personal and emotional. The best choice is the one that aligns with your unique personal circumstances and financial picture. There's no single right answer.
Okay, speaking of big purchases, whether it's that down payment or saving for retirement itself, the book really emphasizes why your time horizon is so important when deciding where to put that money. It's not a one-size-fits-all strategy. The best place to park your savings depends heavily on when you actually plan to use it.
That's absolutely right. It's a critical concept. For very short-term goals, things you need the money for in less than, say, 3 years, cash is generally king. Think high-yield savings accounts or money markets. Why? Because stability is paramount, and inflation's impact over such a short period is usually minimal. You don't want to risk the principal dropping right before you need it. For medium-term goals, maybe 3 to 5 years out, bonds often become a better choice. They typically offer slightly better returns than cash, helping to preserve your purchasing power against inflation more effectively while still being relatively stable compared to stocks. But then for long-term goals, things 5, 10, 20 years down the road, stocks, on average, have historically provided the best returns, beating both cash and bonds significantly over long periods. However, and this is a huge caveat, he stresses, stocks come with much higher volatility. A major market crash right before you need the money for that specific goal could severely delay it or even wipe out a large chunk of your savings. So the key takeaway is to match your saving strategy to your specific time horizon and your personal tolerance for risk. It's not an all-or-nothing decision.
Okay, this leads us naturally to what Nobel laureate William Sharpe famously called the nastiest, hardest problem in finance. Figuring out, well, when can you retire? Feels like a question with no perfect crystal ball.
It really does. It's loaded with uncertainty. But the most famous rule of thumb we have is probably the 4% rule, which was developed by financial planner William Bengen back in the 90s. His groundbreaking research looked back at historical market returns and found that retirees could safely withdraw 4% of their initial portfolio balance, typically assuming a 50-50 stock-bond mix, in the first year of retirement, and then increase that dollar amount by the rate of inflation each subsequent year for at least 30 years without running out of money in almost all historical scenarios. To apply this practically, you essentially need to save up about 25 times your planned annual excess spending in retirement. That's the amount you anticipate needing beyond any guaranteed income sources like Social Security or pensions. So, if you figure you'll need, say, $24,000 per year from your portfolio on top of Social Security, you'd aim for a nest egg of 25 times that, or $600,000. And Maggiulli points out the 4% rule is actually quite conservative for a couple of reasons. One, Bengen himself has argued it might even be closer to 5% now due to lower inflation expectations. Two, the rule assumes your spending increases with inflation every year, but studies show actual retiree spending tends to decline slightly, by about 1% annually on average as people age and naturally slow down.
That's reassuring. But as important as nailing the numbers is, the book strongly reminds us that money isn't the most important factor when it comes to a successful retirement. It's about more than just avoiding a financial crisis, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. He argues it's often more of an existential crisis people face. He quotes author Ernie Zielinski on this. He also mentions Kevin O'Leary, Mr. Wonderful from Shark Tank. O'Leary sold his first company, retired super young at 36, and apparently was just bored out of his mind. He realized work provides not just income, but identity, social interaction, structure, even mental stimulation. Writer Julian Shapiro observed something similar. Friends who sold startups for millions often just drifted back to working on their old side projects because the money alone didn't fundamentally change what gave them purpose or enjoyment. These stories really underscore the crucial need to retire to something, not just from something, work. You need to actively figure out how you'll spend your time, maintain social connections, and find a sense of purpose. Without figuring that stuff out, just having the money often isn't enough to fill that potential void. He even critiques some aspects of the FIRE, financial independence, retire early movement for potentially leading to a lonely existence if not planned carefully.
That's a really important perspective. This whole comprehensive discussion raises another crucial point about the fundamental act of building wealth itself. Why should you invest? Why bother with all this complexity? The book offers 3 really powerful reasons that seem particularly resonant in our modern world.
Yeah, he lays out 3 core motivations. The first is perhaps the most obvious: to save for your future self. It's simple acknowledgement that one day you will likely be either unwilling or unable to work. And investing is how you build the resource pool to support yourself then. He mentions research showing that just seeing a digitally age-progressed photo of yourself actually makes people allocate more to their retirement savings. Connecting with that future self matters. Second, and critically important, to preserve wealth against inflation. As he puts it, inflation is like an invisible tax that constantly, silently erodes the purchasing power of your money. He gives the stat, $1 back in 1926 needed to become $15 by 2020 just to buy the same amount of stuff. But that same $1 invested in U.S. stocks over that period became over $10,000. Investing is really your primary weapon to fight back against that erosion, especially crucial for retirees whose income might be fixed. Third, and this connects back to our earlier discussion, to replace your human capital with financial capital. Your human capital, your ability to earn income through your skills, knowledge, and time, is fundamentally a dwindling asset. Time is finite. Investing allows you to systematically convert that diminishing human capital into productive financial capital, assets like stocks, bonds, real estate, that can continue to pay you long into the future, creating a sustainable income stream that can potentially outlast your working years. This conversion is why simply earning a high income isn't enough. You have to translate it into assets. It explains why many professional athletes, despite earning millions over short careers, tragically go bankrupt if they don't make this conversion effectively and quickly enough.
Okay, so once we're convinced why we should invest, the next massive question is, what should you invest in? There are so many options. Maggiulli strongly challenges the idea that there's some single, one true path to wealth, and instead offers a much more diverse menu of potential income-producing assets.
He really emphasizes this point, using an analogy about his judo instructor who adapted his teaching style for different students. Similarly, he argues, there's no single investment path or guru-prescribed strategy that works for everyone. Many different approaches can be successful depending on your individual circumstances, risk tolerance, and goals. He then lays out a list of common income-producing assets, discussing pros and cons. Stocks, still the most reliable engine for long-term wealth creation historically, despite volatility. Bonds offer lower volatility, diversification, principal safety, but generally lower returns, especially in low-interest rate environments. Investment property, direct ownership, can generate good income, rent, and benefit from leverage, but requires significant work, management, maintenance, and carries concentrated risk in a single property. Real estate investment trusts, REITs, offer real estate exposure and potentially reliable dividend income without the direct management hassles of owning property yourself. Easy to buy through ETFs. He also touches briefly on things like farmland, small businesses franchises, angel investing, and even royalties, like from music or books, as other potential income streams, each with their own unique risk-reward profiles and complexities. Crucially, he explicitly excludes assets like gold, most cryptocurrencies, and art from this list of income-producing assets. Why? Because they don't generate cash flow. Their value is based solely on market perception or speculation about future price increases. He mentions he personally allocates maybe 90% to income-producing assets and keeps only 10% or less in these non-income producing, more speculative categories. The core message throughout the section is the optimal asset allocation is one that works best for your specific situation, your timeline, your risk tolerance. Two very different strategies can both be perfectly valid for two different people.
That makes sense. And this leads us naturally to a really crucial piece of advice, especially for individual investors, one that directly challenges a very popular, almost addictive pastime for some. Why you shouldn't buy individual stocks, he argues, is not just about likely underperformance, it's also about the intense mental game it involves.
Yeah, he illustrates this point vividly with a story about his friend Darren during the GameStop frenzy in early 2021. Darren texted him, thinking about putting 50 of $100K into GME stock. Maggiulli advised against it. Darren bought 300 shares anyway at $107. Within 15 minutes, the price shot up to $140, and he was up $9,000 on paper. Elation. Then, just as quickly, the price plummeted. It fell below its entry point, then kept free-falling. Darren ended up selling around $70, losing $12,000 in just a couple of hours. Maggiulli points out Darren only bet what he was willing to lose, which was smart risk management. But the story perfectly captures the roller coaster, the mental turmoil, fear of missing out, elation, triumph, pain, and regret that's so inherent in trying to pick individual stocks. And beyond that emotional toll, the odds are just stacked against you. He cites the SEBA reports showing that around 75% of professional active fund managers fail to beat their simple market benchmarks over 5-year periods. If the pros struggle, what chance does the average individual have? Plus, market returns are incredibly skewed. Research by Hendrik Bessembinder found that the best-performing 4% of all listed companies since 1926 explain the entire net gain of the U.S. stock market over that period. The other 96% basically canceled each other out or lost value. Picking those few massive winners consistently is like finding needles in a haystack repeatedly. It's also nearly impossible to tell if your success or failure is due to genuine skill or just dumb luck, especially in the short term. Feedback loops are too long and noisy, so unless you're doing it purely for entertainment value with money you can afford to lose, he strongly concludes you should just stick to comparing your results against a simple, low-cost total stock market index fund. For most retail investors, stock picking is a game that's very, very hard to win consistently.
Okay, so if we shouldn't be picking individual stocks and the main mantra is just keep buying, the next logical question becomes, how soon should you invest? When do you pull the trigger? The answer might surprise you if you're one of those people constantly waiting for the perfect moment or for prices to drop first.
Right. He uses this neat analogy about a horse racing analyst, Jeff Cedar, who figured out how to predict racehorse success by analyzing their hurt physiology, ignoring traditional pedigree. He saw American Pharoah was a winner before almost anyone else because he understood the underlying patterns. Similarly, Maggiulli argues, there are underlying patterns in markets, and the most dominant pattern, historically, is that markets tend to go up over the long term. Therefore, every day you wait on the sidelines with cash usually means you'll end up paying higher prices in the future. Plus, that uninvested cash is constantly losing purchasing power to inflation. He runs a simple thought experiment. If you had $1 million to invest over 100 years, would you invest it all now or 1% per year? Obviously, investing it all now is better if assets generally appreciate. And this principle holds true over shorter periods too. His takeaway is blunt. The best time to start was yesterday. The next best time is today. He then directly tackles the invest now versus average in debate for lump sums. Invest now or buy now means putting all the money in at once. Average in, or dollar cost averaging, DCA, over a fixed period means spreading it out, say $1 a month for 12 months. His analysis of historical data is pretty decisive. Average in underperformed buy now by about 2% to 5% for most major asset classes, stocks, bonds, even Bitcoin, in roughly 60% to 80% of all possible starting months between 1997 and 2020. Buy now generally wins this. Now, the caveat is that buy now feels riskier because you have full market exposure immediately. What if the market crashes tomorrow? His clever solution. If you're worried about the risk of buy now with a 100% stock portfolio, consider using a buy now strategy, but for a more conservative portfolio mix, like maybe 60% stocks and 40% bonds. This often gives you similar downside protection risk as averaging in 100% stocks, but usually results in better average returns because you get your money working sooner. Even when considering market valuations like the KP ratio, buy now still tends to outperform average in across the board. Waiting often means missing out on significant gains. The conclusion is pretty robust. Invest sooner rather than later.
That makes perfect sense, and it flows directly into debunking another really tempting strategy that so many people talk about: why you shouldn't wait to buy the dip. It seems so intuitive. Wait for prices to fall, then buy low. But the data, again, tells a very different story.
It really does. He even quotes a famous saying, even God couldn't beat dollar cost averaging, which is quite a statement. He defines buy the dip, BTD, as hoarding cash and only investing it all when the market hits a significant bottom, like the lowest point between two all-time highs. He runs simulations comparing BTD against simple regular dollar cost averaging, DCA, investing the same amount every month, regardless of market level. What he finds is interesting. BTD can work incredibly well if a massive dip happens very early in your investing lifetime, like the 1929 crash for someone starting in 1928. That early boost from buying super low compounds massively. However, over most typical longer time frames, like 40-year investing careers, BTD actually underperforms simple DCA over 70% of the time. Why? Because markets spend most of their time going up. While waiting for the dip, you're missing out on all that growth. The cash drag is significant. He gives an example from 1975-2014 where DCA gets an early lead and maintains it because the BTD strategy misses the 1974 bottom, sits in cash for years, and later dips just don't have enough time left to compound sufficiently to catch up. And the absolutely crucial killer flaw in the BTD strategy is the assumption of perfect foresight. It assumes you know exactly when the bottom is to deploy your cash. His analysis shows that missing the exact bottom by just 2 months, which is incredibly easy to do in real time, results in the BTD strategy underperforming simple DCA a staggering 97% of the time. The takeaway is clear. Trying to save cash to perfectly time market bottoms is largely futile and counterproductive. You're far more likely to miss out on months or even years of compound growth while waiting. His core message echoes again. You should invest as soon and as often as you realistically can. Just keep buying.
Okay, but even with the best strategies like DCA or investing early, the book acknowledges that investing isn't always a smooth ride upwards. It highlights why investing depends on luck and how forces completely beyond our control can have a massive impact on our outcomes.
Yeah, luck undeniably plays a significant role, and it's important to acknowledge that. He uses analogies like Stephen King or J.K. Rowling publishing under pseudonyms. The books were good but sold poorly until the authors' real identities were revealed. Same product, different luck. In investing, this luck manifests in a few key ways. One is the birth year effect. Equity markets go through strong decades and weak decades. He shows how the S&P 500's annualized returns varied wildly, like only 1.9% from 1960-1980 versus 13% from 1980-2000. This means even a skilled investor who consistently beats the market by, say, 5% per year could end up with less money if they invested during a bad decade, like the 70s, compared to an unskilled investor who underperformed the market by 5% but happened to invest during a great decade, like the 80s or 90s. When you start investing matters. Then there's the critical concept of sequence of return risk. If you just buy and hold a lump sum and never add or subtract money, the order of returns doesn't matter. 3 by 2 by 1 is the same as 1 by 2 by 3. But most of us do add or subtract money over time, contributing during our careers, withdrawing in retirement. And when you do that, the order or sequence of returns matters immensely. Getting poor returns early in your career, when your balance is small, is much less damaging than getting those same poor returns late in your career or early in retirement when your portfolio is much larger. A bad decade just before or just after retirement can be devastating. He calls this the end is everything. The investment returns you experience as you approach and enter retirement have a vastly disproportionate impact on your final outcome. The actionable advice here. If you're worried about getting unlucky with a bad sequence of returns near retirement, you can mitigate it. Diversify more heavily into lower risk assets like bonds as you get closer. Consider being flexible with your withdrawal amounts during market downturns if possible, and maybe look for ways to supplement income.
Right, and if luck plays such a big role, and downturns are inevitable, how should we mentally cope with the ups and downs? The book encourages us to actually embrace, rather than fear, this volatility, the price of admission for successful investing.
Absolutely. He shares this incredible, almost legendary story about Fred Smith, the founder of FedEx, in the company's very early struggling days. Apparently, the company had only $5,000 left in the bank, but needed $24,000 immediately to pay for jet fuel to keep the planes flying. Failure meant bankruptcy. So Smith flew to Las Vegas, took the company's last $5,000, sat down at a blackjack table, and somehow won $27,000, enough to pay the fuel bill and keep the company alive for another week. When asked about it later, his rationale was basically, what difference did it make? Without the funds, we couldn't have flown anyway. It was a calculated risk born of desperation. The key lesson Maggiulli draws isn't to gamble, obviously, but that sometimes the biggest risk is taking no risk at all. Inaction can be fatal, and this is especially true in investing. Sitting in cash for decades out of fear of volatility essentially guarantees you fail to build significant wealth. Volatility, he argues, is completely normal. Since 1950, the S&P 500 has experienced an average maximum drop within each year of about 13.7%. The median drop is over 10%. Declines happen all the time. He shows that trying to avoid these drawdowns is incredibly costly. A hypothetical strategy that switched to bonds whenever stocks declined more than 5% would have spent 90% of the time in bonds and produced 90% less wealth than a simple buy and hold strategy from 1950 to 2020. Market timing is hard and costly. Interestingly, he notes that perfectly avoiding only the really big drawdowns, like 15% or more, could theoretically boost returns significantly, but predicting those accurately in advance is essentially impossible. So the conclusion is stark. You must be willing to endure periods of downside, of volatility, in order to earn the long-term upside potential of assets like stocks. Volatility isn't a sign something is wrong. It's simply the price of admission you pay for the chance at higher returns. He quotes Charlie Munger beautifully here. If you're not willing to react with equanimity to a market price decline of 50% 2 or 3 times a century, you're not fit to be a common shareholder. You have to accept it as part of the game.
Okay, so when those inevitable downturns or even full-blown crashes hit, how should we react? Panic? Sell? The book challenges that fear response directly, revealing why market crashes are usually buying opportunities.
Right. He channels the spirit of Baron Rothschild's famous quote, "The time to buy is when there's blood in the streets." While Maggiulli cautions against hoarding cash waiting for a crash, as we discussed with Buy the Dip, he argues that when these crises do occur, they often represent significant opportunities for those who have the means and the courage to act. He reminds us of the simple math of recovery. The bigger the percentage loss, the larger the percentage gain required just to get back to even. A 10% loss needs an 11% gain. A 20% loss needs a 25% gain. A 50% loss requires a 100% gain. Your investment has to double just to break even. He uses the example of the March 2020 COVID crash bottom. The S&P 500 was down about 33%. To recover to its previous highs, it needed about a 50% gain from that low point. But he reframes the question brilliantly. Instead of focusing on how long will it take to recover, he suggests asking, what's my expected annual return if I invest now during the crisis? Using that March 2020 example, if the market recovered in just 1 year, which it mostly did, investing at the bottom would have yielded roughly a 50% annual return. If it took 2 years, that's still a 22% annualized return. Even if it took 5 years, that's an 8% annual return, still beating long-term averages. His historical analysis backs this up. Buying U.S. stocks when they are already down 30% or more has historically given you a greater than 50% chance of earning more than 10% per year during the subsequent recovery. And buying when stocks are down 50% or more, historically, future annualized returns from those points often exceed 25%. That, he says, is the time to back up the truck if you can. The main caveat, of course, is that during a severe crisis, you might not have cash readily available because of broader economic uncertainty affecting your own job or income. And yes, there are exceptions like Japan's market, which peaked in 1989 and still hasn't recovered in nominal terms, but he argues that 7 out of 8 global equity markets have grown purchasing power significantly over the long term. So the conclusion is, don't use rare exceptions as an excuse to perpetually sit in cash, paralyzed by fear. By the time the dust settles and things feel safe again, the market has already staged a significant recovery, leaving the timid investors behind, just like we saw happen incredibly quickly after March 2020.
Okay, we've covered a lot about when to buy and why, but one of the hardest questions for almost every investor is often the flip side: when should you sell? This seems to be where emotional biases run absolutely rampant, and the book aims to provide a clear, rational framework.
That's exactly right. The decision to sell forces you to confront those two powerful, often conflicting emotions: the fear of missing out on potential future gains, FOMO if you sell too early, and the fear of losing more money if you hold on too long during a downturn. It creates real mental turmoil. Maggiulli's solution is simple in concept, though perhaps hard in practice. You need to predetermine your selling conditions beforehand, based on logic and your overall plan, and stick to them. Don't make selling decisions based on your emotional state in the heat of the moment. He identifies 3 generally acceptable rational conditions for selling assets. 1, to rebalance your portfolio. This means selling assets that have grown disproportionately large, usually stocks, to buy assets that have lagged, usually bonds, in order to maintain your target asset allocation, e.g. that 60-40 stock-bond mix. Without rebalancing, a portfolio can become way too stock-heavy and thus riskier than intended over time. He notes that rebalancing often slightly lowers overall long-term returns because you're selling the winners, but its primary benefit is crucial. It manages risk and keeps your portfolio aligned with your comfort level. An annual rebalance is generally sufficient and recommended for simplicity and tax efficiency. 2, to get out of a concentrated or losing position. Selling a concentrated position, like a large holding of a single stock, maybe from an employer, is often wise purely for risk reduction. Trading a maybe higher return for the certainty of reducing risk, e.g. selling stock to pay off a mortgage, can make sense. Selling a losing position might be justified if your original belief about the asset has fundamentally changed, or if a concentrated position just keeps falling and causing too much stress. He suggests having predetermined rules for how to exit, like selling in chunks over time. 3, to meet your financial needs. This is the most obvious and fundamental reason to sell. You need the money. This could be funding your retirement living expenses, making that down payment on a house, paying for a wedding, or handling a major unexpected expense. He offers a key piece of advice here. Fund the life you need before you risk it for the life you want. Secure your base first. He also touches on the diminishing marginal utility of wealth. That extra dollar means less as you get wealthier. Sometimes it's absolutely okay to sell some assets simply to enjoy the fruits of your labor and improve your current quality of life.
All right, that's a really helpful framework for selling. We've covered the what, the when, and the how of building wealth pretty thoroughly. Now let's touch on the often overlooked aspect of where you should be doing all this investing. We're talking accounts, tax implications. This is the part where most of us probably at our first, wait, where'd the rest of my paycheck go? Moment, right. Chapter 19, where should you invest?
Exactly. He even shares his own relatable shock when he received his first real paycheck, seeing all the deductions, and his mother just grinned and said, "Taxes, honey, taxes." It's an inevitable part of the financial landscape we have to navigate. This chapter dives into those practical considerations, particularly the common question of choosing between a traditional 401k or IRA and a Roth 401k or IRA. He tries to simplify this often confusing decision by boiling it down to one core question. Will your effective income tax rate be higher now while you're working and contributing, or later when you're retired and withdrawing? The basic rule is, if you anticipate being in a higher tax bracket now, the traditional account is generally preferred because you get the tax deduction up front when it's more valuable. If you think your tax rate will be higher in retirement, maybe you expect significantly higher income then, or just anticipate tax rates rising overall, then the Roth is better because you pay taxes now at your current, presumably lower rate, and get tax-free withdrawals later. While forecasting future tax rates is obviously tricky, Maggiulli often leans towards the traditional option for many people due to what he calls its optionality. With a traditional account, you control when you pay the taxes in retirement. This gives you flexibility. You might be able to manage your withdrawals in retirement to stay within lower tax brackets, effectively paying a lower overall rate than you would have paid up front with a Roth. However, the Roth does have advantages too, particularly if you're certain your retirement tax rate will be higher, or if you want to effectively get more total dollars into a tax-sheltered account, since Roth contributions are made post-tax. He suggests a why not both strategy can also be smart, contributing some to each type to gain flexibility and hedge against future tax uncertainty.
Makes sense. And sticking with retirement accounts, he offers another piece of distinctly counter-mainstream advice in this section. Why you probably shouldn't max out your 401k. Now that goes against practically everything we hear constantly. What's his reasoning there?
It definitely catches your attention, doesn't it? His argument isn't that 401ks aren't good. They absolutely are, and the tax benefits are significant. He quantifies the annual tax advantage of a 401k over investing the same amount in a regular, well-managed taxable brokerage account as being roughly 0.5% to 0.73% per year. That adds up over decades, for sure. However, his key insight is that this tax benefit, while valuable, might not always outweigh the significant drawback of 401k, the lack of liquidity. Money in a 401k is generally locked up until retirement age, around 59.5, without penalties. He argues that for many people, especially earlier in their careers, other important financial goals might arise before retirement. things like saving for a house down payment, starting a business, paying for children's education, or even just having a robust emergency fund outside of retirement accounts. His point is, don't automatically assume maxing out your 401k is the optimal move if doing so means you can't adequately fund these other important nearer-term life goals. Locking up potentially needed funds for decades requires careful consideration of your overall financial picture and priorities. It's about finding the right balance between long-term retirement security and funding your life along the way. Maybe contributing enough to get the full employer match is sufficient for some, freeing up cash flow for other goals.
That's a really important nuance. Okay, we spend so much time and energy pursuing wealth, but the book delivers a really profound, almost philosophical truth towards the end of the chapter titled, Why You Will Never Feel Rich. And paradoxically, why you probably already are, in a way.
Yeah, this chapter really hits home. He shares the absolutely compelling and ultimately tragic story of Jack Whittaker. This guy won a massive $314 million Powerball jackpot back in 2002. Huge news. But the fascinating detail is that Whittaker was already a millionaire. He was worth about $17 million from his successful construction business before he even bought the lottery ticket. Yet, despite starting from a position of wealth and success, the lottery winnings seemed to unleash chaos. Within just 2 years, he'd reportedly lost almost all of it due to a cascade of personal tragedies, including his granddaughter's overdose, estrangement from his wife, problems with gambling and drinking, and just generally poor choices amplified by the sudden mega-wealth. The core insight Maggiulli draws isn't just about the destructive power of sudden wealth, but the fact that Whittaker, despite being a $17 million millionaire, was still playing the Powerball. It suggests he didn't feel rich even then. This leads into the broader phenomenon he calls the "I'm not rich, they are" syndrome. He shares anecdotes. His friend from a wealthy family who didn't feel rich because his other friend's family was vastly wealthier. His own experience feeling inadequate compared to peers who'd traveled Europe extensively. It seems almost universal. Everyone, except maybe the single wealthiest person on the planet at any given moment, can always point to someone wealthier than themselves. He even mentions Lloyd Blankfein, the billionaire former CEO of Goldman Sachs, famously claiming, "I'm not rich," in an interview. It perfectly illustrates how relative wealth perception is. There's no single objective answer to how rich is rich. Does it mean top 10%, top 1%, top 0.01%, globally, nationally, compared to your city, compared to your age group? The numbers vary wildly. The trick, Maggiulli concludes, isn't necessarily to reach some mythical state of feeling rich, which might never happen due to this relativity trap. The trick is simply not to forget all the people in the world who could be pointing at you and thinking you are rich. It's about cultivating gratitude and perspective on your own relative position.
That's a powerful dose of perspective. This entire journey through Just Keep Buying, from saving and spending to investing and mindset, really culminates in a final powerful message about the one asset that truly matters above all else, an asset you can never, ever get more of. The most important asset.
Yes, the final chapter ties it all together beautifully. He starts with a thought experiment posed by longevity expert Peter Attia. Would you trade places right now with 87-year-old Warren Buffett? You get all his billions, his fame, his status, but you also instantly become 87 years old. Most young or middle-aged people intuitively say, no way. And Attia points out, Buffett himself would almost certainly trade all his wealth in a heartbeat to be 20 years old again, even if he were completely broke. This simple thought experiment powerfully highlights an intuitive truth. Under many circumstances, time is worth far, far more than money. To illustrate this further, Maggiulli tells the incredible true story of Dashrath Manji, known as the Mountain Man of Gilar, India. His village was geographically isolated by a large rocky mountain, forcing residents to walk nearly 30 miles around it just to get supplies or medical care. Tragically, Manji's own wife died because she couldn't get timely medical help due to this obstacle. What did Manji do? Starting in 1960, he spent the next 22 years working almost entirely alone day after day, using only a simple hammer and chisel, chipping away at that mountain. By the early 1980s, he had single-handedly carved a passable path directly through the rock, 360 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 25 feet deep. He moved an estimated 270,000 cubic feet of rock by himself. This path reduced the travel distance for his entire village from over 30 miles down to just 9 miles. The key lesson. Manji didn't have money to hire a construction crew or buy dynamite, but what he did have was time, and the determination to spend it relentlessly on a singular, valuable goal. Time, Maggiulli concludes, is truly your most important and most finite asset.
That's an absolutely incredible story. A testament to what can be achieved with time and focus, even without financial resources. It really shows how time can unlock what money alone often cannot.
Indeed. And Maggiulli brings it back to his own journey. He reflects on his earlier goal to save $500,000 by age 30, a goal he ultimately failed to reach despite investing through a strong bull market. His realization, looking back, was that his mistake wasn't just about optimizing his money, but about failing to optimize his time effectively earlier in his career. Specifically, his career choices. He notes friends who went into big tech firms early on became millionaires relatively quickly due to equity compensation, opportunities he himself had but declined at the time. He points out that an individual's income typically grows most rapidly in their first decade of work, roughly ages 25 to 35. His focus back then, he realizes, should arguably have been more squarely on maximizing his career trajectory and human capital during that critical window, rather than solely obsessing over investment returns on a small starting base. His final thought on this is profound. Though you can always earn more money, nothing can buy you more time. He also touches briefly on the research around the happiness U-curve, how life satisfaction tends to dip in midlife, bottoming around age 50, but then increases again in older age. Young people often overestimate their future happiness, while older people tend to have more realistic, sometimes even overly low, expectations, leading to pleasant surprises that boost well-being later in life. It suggests our perspective on what truly enriches our lives evolves, and we have to make the best decisions we can based on the knowledge and priorities we have at the time. This comprehensive discussion of just keep buying really distills down to a powerful truth. Financial success, and indeed life satisfaction, isn't just about accumulation, it's about intentionality. It's about understanding the nuances of saving and investing, challenging conventional wisdom with data, and recognizing the profound value of time. So as you reflect on all these insights, consider this. What is your most important asset, and how are you investing it today to truly fund the life you need and want?
Thanks for listening, Compound Thought. If you enjoyed this podcast, give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Share with a friend and subscribe so you never miss the next episode. See you next time.